My previous life ended in a sterile, lonely hospital room, my fortune stolen by my husband and his mother using a single, forged document. Yet death refused to keep me sending me back to the exact day they set their ruinous plan into motion. The burning sensation of a second chance far outstripped the memory of flames licking my fingers. They had plotted to steal my father's empire, but now they are the ones who will be begging for loose change. Listen closely. The cold seeped into my bones first, a deep sterile freeze that smelled of bleach and impending failure. The steady, terrifying beep of a heart monitor had been my only companion for 3 days. I remembered the scrape of cheap linoleum against my heels when they dragged me out of my own home. I remembered David's face, not angry, just terribly blankly indifferent, as he watched the security guards toss me onto the street. Then came the darkness, the final gasping breath. I inhaled sharply. Air flooded my lungs thick and warm, scented with expensive espresso and the faint citrusy tang of David's cologne. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't in a hospital ward. I was staring at a vaulted frescoed ceiling, the heavy silk duvet of my own bed pressed down on me. I gripped the sheets. They were real, soft. My fingers weren't skeletal or bruised with IV needles. They were manicured, steady. I sat up, the blood rushing in my ears like a freight train. "Hey, take it easy." I turned. David was adjusting his tie in the mirror. He looked exactly as he had 3 years ago. The sharp jawline, the perfectly styled hair, the dark suit he'd worn to my father's funeral. Yesterday. My father's funeral was yesterday. The digital clock on the nightstand glared in red. October 14th, 2023. 8 a.m. I was back. I stared at my hands, my chest heaving. It wasn't a dream. The memory of dying of untreated pneumonia, penniless and abandoned, because they had frozen my accounts, was a physical weight in my chest. "You're pale, Clara," David said, turning to look at me. He walked over his leather shoes, soft, on the thick carpet, and sat on the edge of the mattress. He reached out to stroke my cheek. I didn't flinch. I let his thumb graze my skin. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to wrap my hands around his throat. "It's going to be a long day," he murmured, affecting a tone of deep sympathy. "Harrison is coming at noon to read the will. My mother is downstairs. She brought pastries. She wants to be here for you. She wants to be here to rob you." "Right," I managed to say. My voice cracked. It sounded like grief to him. To me, it was the sound of a rusted gear finally turning. "I need a shower." "Take your time." He kissed my forehead. The touch made my stomach turn. 20 minutes later, the hot water had washed away the phantom chill of the hospital. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself. I looked alive. I looked soft, a grieving daughter. I grabbed a pair of scissors from the vanity drawer and stared at the sharp steel blades. Not yet. I dressed in a simple black sweater and slacks. When I walked downstairs, the smell of butter and sugar hit me. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, was standing in the kitchen, arranging croissants on a silver platter. She wore a black dress, a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. "Clara, darling," Beatrice cooed, setting down a pastry tong. She rushed over and wrapped her arms around me. She smelled of gin and expensive powder. "I am so sorry. Arthur was a great man." "Thank you, Beatrice," I said, gently, peeling myself away from her embrace. "I made tea." She offered her eyes, darting toward the hallway. She was nervous. The adrenaline was making her twitchy. Actually, Clara, before the lawyer gets here, there's something we need to discuss. Right on schedule. In my previous life, I had been sobbing on the sofa when she brought it up. I had been too blind with grief to question anything. Discuss what? I asked, walking over to the espresso machine and pouring myself a shot. Black, bitter. David walked into the kitchen, his hands shoved into his pockets. He exchanged a quick, loaded glance with his mother. When we were going through Arthur's study last night, David began, his voice low and practiced, looking for the life insurance policies. We found something. Beatrice reached into her oversized leather handbag, resting on the counter. She pulled out a heavy manila envelope. We didn't want to upset you, but knowing Arthur, knowing his state of mind the last few weeks, it makes sense. She slid the envelope across the marble island. I stared at it. Inside was a piece of paper that would legally transfer the executorship of my father's estate and the controlling shares of his company to David. A final addendum, forged by a notary, Beatrice had bribed, predated to a week before my father's fatal heart attack. I reached out and picked it up. The paper was heavy. The metal clasp was cold. "What is it?" I asked, my voice utterly flat. "It's a revised will, Clara," David said, softly, stepping closer. He left the company to me, to manage. In trust for you, of course. He knew you couldn't handle the stress. In my past life, I had collapsed into his arms. I had believed him. This time, I just looked at the envelope. He left it to you. We were shocked too, Beatrice said quickly. But Arthur always valued David's business acumen. He just wanted you protected, sweetie. I see. I tapped the envelope against the marble counter. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. Let's go to the study. I want to read it where he wrote it. The study smelled of old leather and the pipe tobacco my father used to smoke. The massive stone fireplace was blazing. David must have lit it earlier to ward off the autumn chill. The fire crackled, spitting orange embers against the iron grate. I stood in the center of the room, the envelope in my hand. David and Beatrice stood near the doorway, hovering like vultures, waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. I unclasped the metal tab. I pulled out the crisp, white document. 3 pages. My father's signature at the bottom of the third. It was a brilliant forgery. The loop of the A, the sharp slant of the R in Arthur. If I didn't know better, I would have sworn he signed it. I read the words. I, Arthur Pendleton, being of sound mind, do hereby revoke all previous testaments, bequeath the controlling interest of Pendleton Logistics to my son-in-law, David. It's legally binding, Beatrice said from the doorway. She was trying to sound sympathetic, but the raw, naked greed in her voice was unmistakable. Signed and notarized. The lawyer will have to accept it. I looked up at her. He must have written this right before he died. He did, David said, stepping into the room. Clara, I know this is hard, but I promise you nothing changes. I'll take care of the company. I'll take care of you. You won't have to worry about a thing. I won't have to worry. I won't have a house. I won't have my heart medication. I won't have a life. I turned my back to them and faced the fireplace. The heat washed over my face, drying the sudden tears that had sprang to my eyes. Not tears of grief, tears of pure, unadulterated rage. It just doesn't make sense, I said softly. Grief makes us look for logic where there isn't any, David replied, stepping closer. I could hear his shoes on the hardwood. Just hand it to me, Clara. I'll put it in the safe until Harrison arrives. No, I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I just said the word, with the weight of a dying breath. I took half a step forward. The hearth was right in front of me. Clara, David's voice faltered, a spike of confusion. I held the 3 pages by the corner. I extended my arm over the roaring fire. Clara, what are you doing? Beatrice snapped. The fake sweetness vanished instantly. Her voice was shrill, panicked. I opened my fingers. The heavy parchment dropped. No! David lunged forward, but he was too late. He slammed into my shoulder, knocking me aside, and dropped to his knees on the stone hearth. He reached for the fire, but the flames were already hungry. The paper hit the burning logs. For a split second, it just sat there, the edges turning a deep, toasted brown. Then, a tongue of fire caught the corner. The pages curled violently inward, blackening and disintegrating. The forged signature of my father bubbled and vanished into soot. "Are you out of your mind?" David screamed, pulling back his hand as the heat singed his knuckles. He looked at the fire, then up at me, his face twisted in genuine horror. "Do you know what you just did?" "I burned a piece of paper, David," I said, looking down at him. Beatrice rushed into the room, shoving me hard. "You stupid girl!" That was his final will. It was the only copy. The only copy. I tilted my head, feigning innocence. Why would a notary only keep one copy? Why wouldn't it be filed with the state? Unless, of course, the notary was paid to stay quiet. Beatrice froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking old and hollowed out. David scrambled to his feet, grabbing my arms. His grip was bruising. "What is wrong with you? We can get another one. We'll say you burned it in a fit of grief. We have the notary. You have a disgraced paralegal who owes a gambling debt." I interrupted my voice, dropping to a dead, flat calm. I looked down at his hands, gripping my arms. "Let go of me." He stared at me, breathing heavily. He didn't recognize the woman looking back at him. I said, "Let go." He slowly uncurled his fingers. "You're crazy," Beatrice hissed, her chest heaving. "You destroyed a legal document. I'll call the police. I'll have you committed." "Call them," I said, walking over to my father's heavy mahogany desk. I ran my hand along the polished wood. "Tell them I burned a forged document you produced from your handbag the morning of the will reading. Let's see how that plays out in probate court. The burden of proof is on you, Beatrice." And the evidence just went up the chimney. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire finishing its meal. David swallowed hard. He looked at his mother. The panic was settling in cold and absolute. Without that forgery, they had nothing. They were relying on my father's generosity to maintain their lifestyle. David's debts were piling up. Beatrice's credit cards were maxed. They needed the company. "You bitch," David whispered. The doorbell rang, a sharp, clear chime that echoed through the house. I checked my watch. 11:45 a.m. "That will be Mr. Harrison," I said, smoothing down the front of my sweater. I looked at the two of them. They looked like cornered rats. "Shall we go see what my father actually left you?" Mr. Harrison was a man who moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who billed by the hour. He wore a gray 3-piece suit and carried a briefcase that looked older than I was. We sat in the formal living room. The large bay windows let in the pale autumn sunlight, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I sat on the velvet armchair. David and Beatrice sat together on the sofa. They were rigid. Beatrice kept twisting her pearl necklace. David was bouncing his knee, a nervous tick I hadn't noticed in my first life. Harrison clicked his briefcase open. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "Thank you all for being here," Harrison said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Arthur was a personal friend, and his passing is a terrible loss. Before we begin, David Beatrice, you mentioned on the phone earlier this morning that you had found a codicil." Beatrice opened her mouth, her eyes darting toward me. She was calculating. Could she accuse me? Could she claim I burned it? I just smiled at her. A thin, empty smile. "Do it," I thought. "Say it out loud. David started his voice, dry. He cleared his throat. "We made a mistake, Mr. Harrison. It wasn't a will. It was just some old correspondence." Beatrice closed her eyes, defeated. She knew it. Accusing me without the document was hearsay. Worse, it would trigger an investigation into the notary. They couldn't risk the exposure. "Very well," Harrison said, pulling out a thick sheaf of paper, bound in blue cardstock. "This is the last will and testament of Arthur James Pendleton, executed and filed 6 months ago." He began to read. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was clear as glass. My father left the house to me. He left the cars to me. He left 90% of Pendleton Logistics to me. David's breathing grew louder. "To my son-in-law, David." Harrison read his tone neutral. "I leave the sum of his outstanding personal loans, which I have paid in full as of last month. These total $142,000. David blinked. He paid off my debts." "He did," Harrison said, looking over his glasses. "The clause states that this clears your ledger. However, it also stipulates that you are immediately terminated from your position as Vice President of Operations at Pendleton Logistics. Severance is denied, per the morality clause, in your employment contract, referencing the embezzled funds used to accrue said debts." The color drained from David's face entirely. He looked like a corpse. "Embezzled? No, that's a mistake. He knew I was paying that back. The audit files are attached as Addendum B." Harrison noted dryly. "What about me?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the glass coffee table. "Arthur and I were close. He knew I relied on the stipend. For years, my father had paid Beatrice a consulting fee, just to keep the peace. It was $60,000 a year for doing absolutely nothing." Harrison turned the page. "Ah, to Beatrice. Arthur leaves the property located at 442 Elm Street." Beatrice's face relaxed into a look of sheer, arrogant relief. She actually let out a breathless laugh. "The Elm Street property. The commercial building. Oh, Arthur. I knew he wouldn't leave me destitute." She shot me a smug, venomous look. "That building generates $20,000 a month in rent." I didn't break eye contact with her. "Keep reading, Mr. Harrison." Harrison cleared his throat. "The property at 442 Elm Street subject to the $2 million balloon mortgage taken out against it 3 weeks ago. The estate assumes no responsibility for the debt. Ownership transfers immediately, along with the liability." Beatrice's smug smile froze, then shattered. "What? No, that property was owned free and clear." "It was," Harrison agreed, "until Arthur leveraged it to buy out a competitor. The mortgage payments are $22,000 a month. The rent roll is currently $18,000. You are acquiring a property operating at a $4,000 monthly deficit, Mrs. Beatrice, with a balloon payment due in 3 years. I don't accept it." Beatrice shrieked, standing up. "I decline the inheritance. You can certainly do that," Harrison said calmly, closing the folder. "In which case, it reverts to the estate and you receive nothing." Nothing. They were left with absolutely nothing. David was unemployed, his reputation ruined by the embezzlement file my father had quietly built. Beatrice was saddled with a toxic asset or left entirely broke. David looked at me. His eyes were wide, desperate. The handsome, arrogant man who had watched me die was gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified boy. "Clara," David whispered, his voice cracking. "Clara, you have to help us. You're my wife. You control the company now. You can hire me back. You can pay off the mortgage for my mother." I slowly stood up from the armchair. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my black slacks. I walked over to where David sat and looked down at him. "You're right, David. I am your wife." I leaned in close until I could smell that citrus cologne again. "Which is why I'm serving you with divorce papers this afternoon. You have 30 minutes to pack your things and get out of my house." "Clara, please." David dropped to his knees right there on the rug. He reached for my hand. "I love you. I made mistakes, but I love you." I looked at his hands, remembering the cold hospital bed. I stepped back, letting him grasp empty air. 30 minutes, David," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Or I call the police and show them the audit files my father left me. Crawl out of here while you still have legs to walk on." The sound of a deadbolt clicking into place is remarkably final. I stood on the porch of my father's house, my house, and listened to the locksmith drill the old brass cylinders out of the front door. The autumn wind bit at my cheeks, but I barely felt it. I was numb, but it was a good kind of numb. The kind of numb that follows a localized anesthetic before a surgeon cuts out a tumor. David had packed his bags in 26 minutes. He had tried to linger in the foyer, his eyes wet, playing the role of the devastated husband. But I had simply stood by the staircase with my arms crossed, tapping my foot against the hardwood, until he dragged his 2 matching leather suitcases out the door. Beatrice had followed, her face pinched in a mask of sour fury, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits. I let them walk. They had nowhere to go but down. Monday morning, I didn't wear the soft pastel cashmeres David always liked me in. I pulled a sharp, charcoal gray suit from the back of the closet. I tied my hair back into a tight, unforgiving knot. When I stepped out of my car in the parking lot of Pendleton Logistics, the smell of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt hit me. It was the smell of my father's life's work. The corporate headquarters was a brutalist glass and steel cube attached to our primary distribution warehouse. I walked through the double doors at exactly 8 a.m. The receptionist, a young woman named Brenda, dropped her pen when she saw me. "Mrs. Pendleton, Clara, I'm so sorry about your father." "Thank you, Brenda," I said smoothly, not breaking my stride. "Is David in his office?" She blinked, confused. "Mr. Pendleton, yes. He arrived about an hour ago. He called an emergency meeting with the logistics managers for 8:30. Of course he did. David was banking on the inertia of corporate culture. He thought if he just showed up, sat in his leather chair, and barked orders, people would assume he was still in charge. He thought I would be at home, weeping into a monogrammed handkerchief. I took the elevator to the executive floor. The carpet up here was thick enough to swallow the sound of my heels. I bypassed my father's old corner office, the one David had surely already moved his favorite fountain pens into and headed straight for the glass-walled conference room. David was standing at the head of the long mahogany table. He wore his power suit, navy pinstripe, red tie. 4 of our top regional managers were seated around the table, looking uncomfortable. "We need to streamline the Midwest routes," David was saying, leaning his knuckles on the wood. "Arthur was too sentimental about keeping those legacy drivers on the payroll. We're bleeding capital. I want termination notices drafted by Friday." I pushed the glass door open. It didn't squeak. It glided. "The only termination notice being drafted today is yours, David," I said. The room froze. The 4 managers snapped their heads toward me. David stiffened his knuckles, turning white against the mahogany. He slowly stood up straight, plastering on a patronizing smile. "Clara, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with forced patience. "You shouldn't be here. You're grieving. Go home. I'm handling the transition. You aren't handling anything." I walked into the room and dropped a heavy black binder onto the center of the table. The thud made one of the managers flinch. "Gentlemen, my father left the controlling interest of Pendleton Logistics entirely to me. David has been terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and embezzlement." David's patronizing smile vanished. "Clara, stop this. You're having a breakdown. I'm taking you home." He stepped toward me, reaching for my arm. I didn't back away. I looked him dead in the eye. "Touch me, and I will have security break your wrist." He stopped. The absolute lack of fear in my voice paralyzed him. I opened the black binder and slid a stack of photocopied pages down the center of the table. Page 3 details the phantom vendor accounts David set up to siphon company funds to pay off his gambling debts in Atlantic City. Page 7 contains the wire transfers. Page 12 is the internal audit my father completed just 2 weeks before he died. The regional managers, men who had golfed with David, men who had laughed at his jokes, eagerly grabbed the pages. Loyalty in the corporate world is thinner than paper. They read the numbers. Their faces hardened. "This is a witch hunt," David yelled, his voice cracking slightly. The veneer was cracking. Arthur was old. He was confused. Those accounts were legitimate holding funds. They were registered to a P.O. box in Delaware under your mother's maiden name, I replied dryly. I turned to Tom, the head of HR, who had been sitting quietly in the corner. "Tom, please escort David to his office. Give him 1 cardboard box. He has 10 minutes to clear his personal effects. If he attempts to take any company files or electronics, call the police." Tom, a burly man who had worked for my father for 20 years, stood up. He didn't look at David with pity. He looked at him like a rat he'd caught in the pantry. "This way, David. You can't do this," David screamed, his face flushing violently purple. "I built this company's modern infrastructure. You need me. You don't know the first thing about freight. I know how to read a balance sheet," I said coldly. "And I know how to cut dead weight. 10 minutes, David." I turned my back on him. It was the most empowering feeling in the world. I listened to his heavy, defeated footsteps echo down the hall, followed by Tom's steady tread. I looked at the remaining managers. "Now," I said, taking my father's old seat at the head of the table, "let's talk about the Midwest routes. If taking the company from David was a surgical strike, dismantling Beatrice was a slow, agonizing bleed. 3 weeks had passed since the will reading. The autumn leaves had died, leaving the trees bare and skeletal against the gray November sky. I was sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of my divorce attorney when I got the first real update on my mother-in-law's situation. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, slid a financial disclosure form across her desk. David's representation is contesting the prenuptial agreement, Sarah said, tapping the paper with a silver pen. They're claiming you signed it under duress, and he's demanding $50,000 a month in spousal support to maintain his accustomed standard of living. I actually laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was dry and sharp, like breaking glass. He wants $50,000 a month. Does he even have a job? No, Sarah said. His reputation in the logistics sector is radioactive. Nobody will touch him after the rumors of the embezzlement audit got out. He's currently living in an extended stay hotel off the interstate. But that's not the interesting part. Look at page 4. I flipped the pages. It was a breakdown of Beatrice's assets. Beatrice had tried to play the grand dame of Elm Street. For the first 2 weeks, she strutted around town, bragging to her country club friends about the massive commercial building Arthur had left her. She had even tried to hire a contractor to renovate the lobby, dreaming of slapping her name in brass letters above the door. Then, the first of the month hit. The balloon mortgage payment was due on the 1st, Sarah explained, leaning back in her chair. $22,000. The building only generates $18,000 in rent, and one of the anchor tenants, a boutique bakery, just broke their lease. I looked at the numbers. Beatrice's checking account balance was listed at a pathetic $3,412. How did she make the mortgage payment? I asked. Sarah smirked. She didn't. She paid the bank $15,000 and begged for an extension on the rest. According to the discovery documents, she sold her vintage Rolex and a diamond tennis bracelet to a pawn shop 3 towns over, just to get that much cash together. The image of Beatrice, proud, arrogant, elitist Beatrice, haggling with a pawnbroker under a buzzing neon sign, filled me with a profound, vindictive warmth. In my past life, she had stood over my hospital bed, wearing that very same Rolex, checking the time, while I struggled to breathe. She had complained that my dying was making her late for a lunch reservation. The bank is threatening foreclosure if she doesn't bring the account current by the 15th. Sarah continued, David is legally tethered to her now. He has no income, and she's bleeding cash to keep a toxic asset afloat. They are drowning Clara. Good. Let them choke on the water. I closed the folder. What about the infidelity clause in the prenup? Sarah pulled out another file. I hired the private investigator you asked for. You were right. She handed me a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal. That part of my heart had died in the hospital. I only felt the cold satisfaction of holding a loaded weapon. The photos showed David in various stages of undress, with a blonde woman who looked remarkably like a younger, cheaper version of me. The timestamps on the photos went back 2 years. 2 years of stolen weekends, expensive dinners, charged to my father's credit cards, and lies whispered into my hair while we lay in bed. Her name is Ashley, Sarah said neutrally. She's a real estate agent. She thought David was going to leave you and take half the company. Once he got fired, she blocked his number. Perfect. I slid the photos back across the desk. Attach these to our response. Deny the spousal support request entirely. File for immediate dissolution of the marriage with cause. I want him to have absolutely nothing. 2 days later, the mediation session took place. We met in a neutral conference room downtown. I sat on one side of a long glass table with Sarah. The door opened, and David walked in with a court-appointed lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. David looked terrible. The sharp jawline was obscured by days of dark stubble. His skin had a gray, waxy pallor. The Brioni suit he wore was wrinkled, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap hotel soap. He didn't look at me when he sat down. He kept his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table beneath the glass. "Let's make this quick," Sarah started, not even offering a customary greeting. She pushed our response packet across the table. David's lawyer opened it. He scanned the first few pages, his brow furrowing. Then he turned to the section with the photographs. He stopped. He stared at the glossy image of his client walking out of a motel room with another woman. The lawyer sighed a long, tired sound and closed the folder. He looked at David. "You told me you had been entirely faithful. You told me the morality clause couldn't be triggered." David's head snapped up. He grabbed the folder and ripped it open. His eyes locked onto the photos. The last of his color drained away. "Clara," he whispered, finally looking at me. His eyes were bloodshot. It didn't mean anything. It was just a 2-year mistake." I interrupted, my voice perfectly level. "Or just a way to pass the time while you waited for my father to die so you could forge his will." David flinched as if I had struck him. His lawyer looked alarmed. "Forged will? What is she talking about?" "Nothing," David said quickly, his voice trembling. "She's just angry." "I'm not angry, David. I'm bored." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You have no money. You have no job. Your mother is currently defaulting on a multi-million-dollar commercial loan. You are living in a roach motel off Route 9. If you push this to court, I won't just bury you with the infidelity. I will release the embezzlement files to the district attorney. You won't just be broke. You'll be in a federal penitentiary." I let the silence hang in the room. The hum of the air conditioner sounded like a jet engine. "Sign the papers, David," I said softly. "Sign them, walk away, and I let you stay out of prison. That is my final and only offer." David looked at his lawyer. The lawyer simply nodded, sliding a pen across the table. With a shaking hand, David picked up the pen. He didn't read the agreement. He just flipped to the back page and scrawled his name on the dotted line. He left his claim to the house. He left his claim to the company. He left with the clothes on his back. He dropped the pen and covered his face with his hands. A quiet, pathetic sob escaped his throat. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the room without looking back. Winter hit the city hard that year. By late January, the streets were coated in a thick, grimy layer of black slush. The cold seeped through everything, turning the world gray and bitter. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my CEO office, holding a mug of Earl Grey tea, watching the snow fall over the shipping yard. Pendleton Logistics was thriving. Without David's parasitic draining of our accounts, and with the dead weight of the Midwest roots restructured, our Q4 profits had soared. I felt alive. I felt powerful. My desk phone buzzed. "Yes, Brenda," I answered, keeping my eyes on the snow. "Ms. Pendleton," Brenda said, her voice hesitant. "There's, David is down here in the lobby." I took a slow sip of my tea. The warmth bloomed in my chest. "Did he cause a scene?" "No, ma'am. He's just standing by the security desk. He's asking to speak with you. He says it's an emergency. He looks really bad, Clara. Send him up, but have 2 security guards escort him." 5 minutes later, the elevator doors chimed. I turned around and leaned against the edge of my mahogany desk. The heavy oak doors to my office opened. If I hadn't known it was him, I might not have recognized the man standing between my two uniformed guards. David was drowning in a cheap, oversized parka that looked like it had come from a thrift store. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out and rimmed with dark bruised circles. His boots were scuffed and wet with dirty snow. He looked at the office, his old office. He looked at the leather chair, the crystal decanter on the shelf, the warmth of the space. Then he looked at me. "Clara," he rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "You have 2 minutes, David. What do you want?" He swallowed hard. He took a step forward, but the guard put a thick hand on his chest, stopping him. David looked at the hand, then back at me, humiliation warring with desperation in his eyes. "It's my mother," he said, his voice breaking. "The bank foreclosed on the Elm Street property yesterday. They seized everything in her accounts to cover the penalty fees. She was evicted this morning. I didn't blink. And we have nowhere to go, Clara." The anger flared up a brief dying ember in the ash of his pride. "The hotel kicked us out. My credit is ruined. I can't even rent an apartment. We're sleeping in her car. It's 10 degrees outside. That sounds like a personal problem," I said, smoothly setting my mug down on a coaster. "Perhaps she should have sold more of her jewelry." "She sold it all," he cried, the anger vanishing, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "The pearls, the bags, the clothes, it all went to the mortgage. She has nothing left. I have nothing left. Please, Clara, I'm begging you." To my absolute shock, David's knees buckled. He didn't just fall. He dropped. Right there on the plush carpet of my office. He fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he began to weep loudly, pathetically. The 2 security guards exchanged an uncomfortable glance, unsure of what to do with the sobbing shell of a man on the floor. "Just a loan," David gasped between sobs, looking up at me from his knees. Snot ran from his nose. His dignity was entirely gone. He was literally crawling. "Just enough for a security deposit on an apartment. $1,000, $500, anything. Please, Clara. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. Just don't let my mother freeze in a car." I looked down at him. I thought about the hospital room. I thought about the beep of the monitor. I thought about how cold I had been knowing they had frozen my accounts to prevent me from seeking specialized treatment. They hadn't just wanted my money. They had been perfectly content to let me die for it. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out my checkbook and a sleek black pen. David's crying hitched. He watched my hands, a pathetic, desperate spark of hope lighting up his red, swollen eyes. He thought he had broken me. He thought the sight of him on his knees had touched some lingering shred of love I held for him. I wrote out a check. I signed my name with a flourish. I tore it from the book. I walked around the desk. My heels clicked loudly on the hardwood border of the room. I stopped right in front of him. He looked up, his hands trembling, as he reached out to take the piece of paper. I held it just out of his reach. "Look at the amount, David," I whispered. He squinted through his tears. His eyes focused on the ink. The check was made out to cash. The amount was $0. In the memo line, I had written, "For the hospital bills." David froze. The hope died in his eyes, so fast, it was almost physical. He stared at the zeros. He stared at the memo line. The confusion morphed into a stark, horrified understanding. He finally realized that this wasn't just a bitter ex-wife. This was something colder, something absolute. I let go of the check. It fluttered down, landing softly on the carpet next to his wet boot. "I don't have a husband," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a stone vault. "And I don't give handouts to stray dogs who bite. Get out of my building, David. If you ever come near me, my company, or my home again, I will make sure you freeze in a cell instead of a car." I looked up at the guards. "Escort him out. If he resists, throw him out." David didn't resist. He was empty. The guards hauled him to his feet by his armpits. He didn't look at me again. He just stared blankly at the floor as they dragged him out of the office, his wet boots leaving dirty streaks on the carpet. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them. I stood alone in the quiet office. I picked up my mug of tea. It was still warm. I walked back over to the window and watched the snow fall. A few minutes later, I saw a small figure emerge from the front doors of the building, flanked by two larger ones. They pushed him out into the cold. David stumbled on the icy pavement, falling to his hands and knees. He stayed there for a long time, a dark speck against the blinding white snow, shivering in the winter wind. I took a sip of my tea. It tasted perfect, but my father's empire was vast, and the rats that had nested in it while I was dying weren't all gone yet. David and Beatrice were broken, but the people who had enabled them, the corrupt notary, the board members who had turned a blind eye, were still comfortable. I wasn't done burning things down. I was just getting started. The problem with pests is that you rarely just have two. David and Beatrice were the rats in the kitchen, eating the crumbs out in the open. But to forge a will to successfully orchestrate the theft of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, they needed termites in the foundation. I spent the rest of the winter tearing up the floorboards. My father was a brilliant man, but he was old school. He trusted a handshake. He trusted loyalty. I trusted forensic accountants. I hired a private firm out of Chicago, ruthless, meticulous people who didn't care about the local country club politics. I gave them full access to the company servers, my father's personal accounts, and the legal filings from the last 5 years. It took them 3 weeks to find the first termite. Richard Hayes was the longest-serving member on our board of directors. He was a man who wore tweed jackets with elbow patches and spoke with a booming, grandfatherly baritone. He had spoken at my father's funeral, wiping away a stray tear as he talked about their decades of friendship. According to the Chicago auditors, Richard's friendship involved quietly rubber-stamping David's phantom vendor accounts in exchange for a clean 15% cut routed through a shell company in the Caymans. Richard knew David was stealing. Richard had helped him hide it. I didn't call a board meeting. I didn't give him the dignity of an audience. I waited until a Tuesday evening. Richard had a standing dinner reservation at an upscale steakhouse downtown every Tuesday at 7. I arrived at 7:15. The maitre d' tried to stop me, but I walked past him, navigating the dim, mahogany-paneled dining room until I spotted Richard in a corner booth. He was halfway through a dry martini, laughing at something his wife was saying. I slid into the curved leather booth right next to him. Richard spilled his drink. The olive rolled onto the white linen tablecloth. "Clara, good God, you startled me. What are you doing here? We're having a private dinner." His wife, a thin woman, weighed down by heavy diamond jewelry, looked at me with polite annoyance. "I won't take much of your time, Richard. I said, keeping my voice low, pleasant, and utterly devoid of warmth. I pulled a folded manila envelope from my purse and laid it flat on the table, right over the spilled gin. I brought you a gift. He frowned, looking at the envelope, then back at me. The grandfatherly facade slipped just for a second, revealing the cold, calculating man underneath. Clara, if this is business, call my office tomorrow. It won't wait until tomorrow. I insisted, tapping the paper. He hesitated, then picked it up. He broke the seal and pulled out the top sheet. It was a wire transfer log, highlighted in bright yellow ink, showing the exact route his 15% cut took from Pendleton Logistics to a bank in Nassau. The color drained from Richard's face so fast, I thought he might pass out. His jaw went slack. The paper trembled in his hand. "Richard," his wife asked, her voice shrill. "What is it?" "Shut up, Martha," he hissed. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak to her without that booming, jovial tone. He looked at me. The fear in his eyes was identical to the fear I had seen in David's. It was the terror of a man watching his life's work evaporate. "Where did you get this?" "I own the servers, Richard. I own the company. I own you." I leaned in closer. I could smell the gin on his breath, mixed with the metallic scent of sudden sweat. "My father trusted you. He ate at your house, and you let his son-in-law bleed him dry." "Clara, listen to me," he whispered, frantically, leaning forward to shield the documents from his wife's view. I didn't know the extent of it. David came to me. He said it was a temporary cash flow solution for a side project. I paid the money back. Well, most of it. Liar. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to resign your seat on the board, citing sudden health issues. I told him, you will surrender your shares in the company back to the estate at 10 cents on the dollar. If I don't have your resignation in the signed transfer by 9:01, I am walking these files into the SEC office, and then I'm going to the FBI. My shares, he choked out. That's my retirement, Clara. That's millions of dollars. You should have thought about your retirement before you stole from a dying man. I slid out of the booth and stood up. I looked down at his wife, who was staring at us in bewildered horror. Enjoy your steak, Martha. Tell the waiter to put it on a credit card. I have a feeling Richard's company accounts are about to be frozen. I walked out of the restaurant into the cold evening air. One down, one to go. The notary was easier, but far more pathetic. His name was Gregory Palmer. He operated out of a strip mall on the edge of town, sandwiched between a failing laundromat and a discount liquor store. The neon sign in his window buzzed with a dying N. I walked into his office the next morning. The bell above the door jingled cheerily, completely at odds with the stale smell of cigarette smoke and cheap carpet cleaner inside. Gregory was sitting behind a laminate desk, eating a powdered donut over a stack of tax forms. He looked up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He recognized me immediately. He had been there the day I married David. He had notarized the marriage certificate. He stopped chewing. "Mrs. Pendleton," he mumbled white powder, dusting his chin. "Mr. Palmer." I didn't sit down. There was nowhere clean to sit anyway. I stood in front of his desk. "I burned the will, Gregory, the one you forged for David and Beatrice." He didn't try to deny it. He didn't feign outrage. He just slumped in his chair, a profound weariness washing over his face. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the executioner for months. "They paid me $10,000. He confessed, his voice barely a rasp. "I have a bookie in the city. He was going to break my legs, Clara. I'm sorry. I knew Arthur. I knew it was wrong. Sorry doesn't fix it, Gregory. Sorry doesn't unforge a document that nearly left me on the street." "Are you calling the cops?" He looked toward the door as if expecting to see flashing blue lights. "No." I pulled out a heavy digital recorder from my coat pocket and set it on his desk. I pressed the red button. "You are going to confess, right now. You are going to state your name, your license number, and exactly how David and Beatrice approached you. You will detail the amount they paid you. You will surrender your notary license to the state by Friday. You will close this office." He stared at the red light of the recorder. "And if I do, you let me walk. I keep this recording in a safe deposit box." I promised him, "If I ever see your name on a legal document in this state again, if I ever hear you speak David or Beatrice's names, I give the tape to the district attorney." Gregory looked around his dismal office. He looked at the powdered sugar on his desk. He pressed his hands against his face, rubbing his eyes before reaching out and pulling the recorder closer. "My name is Gregory Thomas Palmer." I listened to him confess to his own ruin. I took the recorder, dropped it in my pocket, and walked out. The termites were gone. The house was finally mine. Spring arrived, dragging a reluctant, muddy thaw across the city. The snow melted, revealing the dead grass in the trash that had been buried all winter. I was sleeping better. The phantom chill of the hospital room was finally beginning to fade from my bones. I was eating again. I was living. It was a Tuesday night in late April when the security alarm in my house tripped. It wasn't the piercing neighborhood waking siren. I had upgraded the system. It was a silent alarm that sent a high-priority alert directly to my phone and the private security firm I had on retainer. I woke up in the dark, my phone vibrating violently against the nightstand. I grabbed it. The screen glared, "Zone 4, breach. First floor study." My father's old study. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden primal spike of adrenaline. I didn't turn on the lamp. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. I moved to the heavy oak door of my bedroom, locked it from the inside, and pulled a heavy brass fireplace poker from the stand near the hearth. I checked my phone again. The security company had already dispatched a car. Police were en route. 3 minutes out. I didn't wait. I crept down the back staircase, the one that led to the kitchen. The house was utterly silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. I moved through the dark dining room, gripping the brass poker until my knuckles ached. I reached the hallway. The door to the study was ajar. A faint, frantic beam of light was sweeping rapidly across the bookshelves. Someone was looking for something. I pressed my back against the wall, edging closer to the doorframe. I listened. I heard the scrape of wood against wood, the sound of books being shoved onto the floor, heavy, panicked breathing. Then a voice muttering in the dark. "Where is it, you old bastard? I know you kept it here." It was a woman's voice, shrill, desperate, and broken. Beatrice. I lowered the poker. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy disgust. I stepped into the doorway and reached for the dimmer switch on the wall. I pushed it all the way up. The brass chandelier overhead flooded the room with harsh, blinding light. Beatrice shrieked, dropping the flashlight. It clattered against the stone hearth. She spun around, throwing her hands up to shield her eyes. When her vision adjusted, she stared at me. I barely recognized her. The pearls were gone. The expensive makeup was gone. Her hair, once styled in a perfect, rigid helmet, was stringy and gray at the roots. She wore a stained, oversized trench coat and dark slacks. She looked like a ghost that had been dragged backward through a briar patch. She was standing in front of the oil painting of my grandfather. She had swung the heavy frame away from the wall, exposing the small steel wall, safe hidden behind it. "What are you doing in my house, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice calm, almost conversational. She stared at me, her chest heaving. The sheer indignity of being caught froze her for a long moment. Then the desperation took over. "He promised me." She spat, her voice trembling. She pointed a shaking finger at the safe. "Arthur promised me the emeralds. His mother's emerald necklace. He said it was for me. My father's mother died 50 years ago. Beatrice, those emeralds belong to the estate. They belong to me. I have nothing," she screamed. It wasn't an angry scream. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap, chewing its own leg off. "The car was repossessed yesterday. We are sleeping in a shelter. Clara, a shelter. People look at me. They smell like urine and cheap bleach. You broke into my home to steal jewelry." I shook my head slowly. "You really are just a common thief. You always were. You just used to wear better clothes to do it." She lunged. It wasn't a calculated attack. It was pure, mindless frustration. She scrambled over the fallen books, her hands curled into claws, aiming for my face. I didn't even raise the poker. I simply sidestepped. Beatrice tripped over a heavy leather-bound encyclopedia, her momentum carrying her forward. She crashed hard into the solid oak desk, her hip striking the edge with a sickening thud. She collapsed onto the Persian rug, crying out in pain, clutching her side. Red and blue lights flashed through the bay windows, painting the study in rapid strobe-like pulses. Tires screeched on the gravel driveway outside. Heavy fists began pounding on the front door. "Police, open up." Beatrice looked at the flashing lights. The fight drained out of her entirely. She curled into a ball on the floor, burying her face in the dusty rug, sobbing. "You ruined us." She wept, her voice muffled by the carpet. "You ruined my boy. You ruined my life." I walked over to the desk and looked down at her. "Sigh. No, Beatrice," I said, the flashing police lights reflecting in the glass of the window panes. "You dug the grave. You and David built the coffin. I just stopped fighting and let you fall in." I turned and walked to the front door to let the officers in. I watched them handcuff her. I watched them read her rights. She didn't fight them. She didn't speak. She just kept her head down, a hollowed-out shell of a woman, as they led her out into the cold spring night and placed her in the back of the cruiser. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights fade down the street. The anniversary of my death passed without a sound. In my previous life, October 17th was the day my lungs finally gave out in that sterile hospital room, the machines flatlining, while David signed the papers to liquidate my father's assets. In this life, October 17th was a Tuesday. It was sunny. I had a breakfast meeting with the new regional managers, signed off on the acquisition of a rival trucking fleet, and ate a turkey sandwich at my desk. I survived. The company had not just stabilized under my control, it had evolved. I stripped away the bloated executive salaries, fired the dead weight that David had hired to stroke his ego, and invested heavily in modern tracking software. Pendleton Logistics was leaner, faster, and infinitely more profitable. I didn't just inherit my father's empire, I conquered it. I took the afternoon off. I bought a bouquet of white lilies, my father's favorite, and drove out to the cemetery. The grounds were quiet, the oak trees shedding their bronze leaves over the manicured grass. I walked up the gentle hill to the family plot. The black granite headstone was polished and clean. Arthur James Pendleton, a builder of roads and men. I laid the lilies at the base of the stone. "We did it, Dad," I whispered, the autumn wind pulling at my coat. "The house is clean." I stood there for a long time, watching the clouds drift over the city skyline in the distance. The rage that had fueled me since the moment I woke up in that bed was gone. The fire had burned out. There was nothing left to consume. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just free. I walked back to my car, a sleek black sedan. As I pulled out of the cemetery gates and merged onto the main avenue, the traffic slowed. Construction was bottlenecking the lanes down to a crawl. I tapped my fingers on the leather steering wheel, listening to the quiet hum of the radio. I glanced out the passenger window. We were stopped next to a large commercial gas station. A man was out by the pumps, wearing a bright orange, grease-stained, high-visibility vest. He held a heavy push broom, sweeping wet trash and cigarette butts off the concrete. He paused, leaning on the broom handle to wipe the sweat from his forehead. It was David. He looked older, so much older. The sharp, arrogant angles of his face had softened into a dull, beaten doughiness. His hair was thinning. His shoulders were permanently hunched, carrying the invisible weight of a life ruined by his own greed. He didn't see me. He was staring blankly at the pavement, lost in whatever miserable reality he now inhabited. His mother was serving a 3-year sentence in a state penitentiary for burglary and resisting arrest. He was sweeping up garbage for minimum wage. The traffic light turned green. The car behind me honked. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't honk to get his attention. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy or a twinge of pity. I felt absolutely nothing. He was a stranger, a ghost from a timeline that no longer existed. I took my foot off the brake, pressed the accelerator, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I had a company to run. I had a life to live. And for the first time since the fire in the study, I wasn't looking backward. I was only looking forward. The ashes of my past were cold, and the road ahead was entirely mine. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes the only way to heal from betrayal is to stop being the victim and become the architect of your own justice. I burned their lies, and from that ash I built a life they could never touch. If my journey resonated with you, or if you've ever had to cut toxic, greedy people out of your own life, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deeply personal first-person stories. Share this video with someone who needs the strength to stand up for themselves. And drop a comment below. How would you have handled David and Beatrice? I read every single one. Stay strong and see you next time.